And welcome back, guys, to Between Bells and Cheddar News. 2021, a big year for the cannabis industry, Hannah, as several key states legalized adult-use cannabis, while federal lawmakers introduced a dozen legalization bills. Plus, big tech took a stand, and M&A warmed up in a very big way, and that sets quite the stage for next year here.
Yeah, so with the new year just around the corner, it's time to pull out our crystal balls. Here with more is Cheddar correspondent Chloe Aiello. Chloe, my friend, great to see you. Let's talk about politics first. What can we expect from 2022 as far as federal policy reform goes?
Hey, Hannah. Well, there is potentially a lot on the table in 2022, but let me back it up and give a quick review of 2021. So that was supposed to be the year of federal reform. We had major CEOs, including David Klein of Canopy Growth, betting on it. But of course, that wasn't the case, but we can see why he was optimistic. So for one thing, we had Senators Schumer, Wyden, and Booker release their comprehensive decriminalization bill, the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act. It served, as I mentioned, comprehensive legalization and equity provision, but it also had a 25% proposed tax rate and proposed increased FDA involvement, which the industry found difficult to get on board with. And with this type of more comprehensive bill, it is a tough sell in the Senate where it needs 60 votes to pass. Republican from South Carolina, Representative Nancy Mace, did release her answer to that bill later on in the year. The States Reform Act, it proposed regulating cannabis similar to alcohol, a significantly lower tax rate, as well as minimal FDA involvement. But it doesn't have any equity provisions, which could make that a tough sell among Democrats. Safe banking, which we talk about all the time on here, does actually have broad bipartisan support, but it faces opposition not only from more conservative lawmakers, but also from more progressive ones who have a very specific idea of how cannabis should pass, namely with equity provisions. So that contributed to, of course, its removal from the National Defense Authorization Act at the close of 2021, and yet another defeat for this bill. But Cowen analyst Vivian Azer, who spoke to us a couple of weeks ago, believes that we will see some form of reform in 2022, either leading up to the midterm elections or afterwards in the lame duck session. The timing, of course, is vital because, in spite of Mace's bill, it's not clear whether a Republican-controlled Congress, which, could be the outcome of the 2022 midterms, will prioritize cannabis. As for what this bill could look like, Azer anticipates it might look something like the States Act, which, of course, leaves regulation largely up to states whether they want to legalize or not, with some equity provisions. If that can't happen, then she anticipates safe banking should Senator Schumer come around to it.
All right, Chloe, this year was a robust year when it came to M&A. How do you sort of think that that's going to set the stage for next year? And are we expecting any other sort of big mergers and deals to happen next year?
Yes, well, a lot of folks think so. So as you mentioned, this was a big year. Viridian Capital Advisors, which tracks transactions in the cannabis industry, noted that through the week ending December 17th, there were 306 transactions in year to date in 2021, compared with 86 in 2020, which of course was a bit of an outlier year. But of those, 209 targeted U.S. companies, and there was a record $10 billion in consideration for the U.S. Notable deals did include Trulieve's $2.1 billion acquisition of Harvest Health and Recreation, which did usher in the return of billion-dollar deals in U.S. cannabis. We had the $4 billion Tilray-Aphria merger. We also had the pharmaceutical industry getting involved. We had a $7.2 billion acquisition of GW Pharmaceuticals by Jazz Pharmaceuticals, and of course, Pfizer just announcing its $6.7 billion intended acquisition of Arena Pharmaceuticals. In 2022, MJ Biz CEO Chris Walsh anticipates M&A will continue to heat up with at least 3 or 4 major mergers on the horizon or acquisitions occurring in the U.S. and Canada. Viridian says discounted valuations will drive M&A and that all but the biggest multi-state operators are in play for acquisitions. It did identify a couple of targets, namely Forefront, Harborside, Lowell Farms, Planet 13, and Schwazi, among others, as the industry, of course, moves to consolidate in advance of major significant federal reform.
And brand building is notoriously difficult in cannabis. Could 2022 be the year we see national brands emerge here?
I spoke to BDSA's Jessica Lucas about this, and she thinks that it could be the year of the brand. Brand building, as you mentioned, is difficult in cannabis, due, mostly to the fact that regulations differ on a state-by-state basis, sometimes even on a county-by-county basis. So it's really difficult. It's really expensive for cannabis companies to expand this way and get their products and brand out to the world. That's why we tend to see multi-state operators having, the most success in terms of brand building. And brand loyalty in general in cannabis doesn't tend tend to be much of a driver of purchasing, according to BDSA, as much as other factors like a positive experience with a product, for example. But 2022 could be the year that changes. And the brands that are sort of on BDSA's radar include Cookies, Warner Brands, Wild, Kiva, Steezy, and certain MSO brands like Cresco Labs. These could start to earn more customer loyalty and consistency and drive more consistent spending. The cannabis industry is going to be a little bit different still from, the beverage industry, the tobacco industry when it comes to brand building as well as loyalty. But, that's going to be the case at least until we see more comprehensive federal reform. And, one of the ways that brands are spreading right now is through licensing out their IP. And that's what Cookies, for example, has had a lot of success with.
Chloe, how will U.S. operators and even CPG companies maybe think about global cannabis opportunities heading into next year here?
Well, we talk all the time here about the U.S. cannabis opportunity and even the Canadian cannabis opportunity, but we don't spend a lot of time talking about Europe, talking about Latin America, and these are really promising markets. So in December, Malta became the first European country to legalize cannabis. Others, including Germany, are expected to follow soon. Meanwhile, draft legislation of, cannabis legalization is, reportedly on the table in Mexico, and multiple other South and Central American countries are considering working on legislation as well. So, while these markets pose a potentially more modest opportunity compared to the U.S., which is expected to, of course, be the biggest cannabis market in the world once, it is fully online, it's nevertheless an attractive opportunity for a lot of cannabis operators who, potentially can have, first mover advantages in that area and, expand beyond the U.S. But Jess from BDSA doesn't anticipate many CPG companies seizing on this opportunity. Instead, they're kind of waiting and seeing and, sort of getting exposure to the U.S. market, the Canadian market when they can. But instead, we might see MSOs, multi-state operators here in the U.S. and Canadian companies, which are already focused, pretty heavily internationally, continue to kind of expand. But I do want to mention that Viridian Capital Advisors is warning investors that these markets could actually be a distraction for companies, particularly those in the U.S., away from the U.S. market, and to, if they're going to invest in a more pure play international cannabis company.
Cheddar correspondent Chloe Aiello, great report.